The estate sat at the end of a long gravel road, flanked on both sides by Douglas firs so tall they seemed to hold the sky up. I had never seen a house that felt more like a fortress. All dark stone and high windows, wrought iron gates swung open just enough for my second-hand truck to slip through. The engine rattled as I crept up the drive, my knuckles pale on the steering wheel, my stomach doing things that I told myself were just nerves. Just nerves. Not morning sickness. Not the persistent low-key nausea that had been my constant companion for 7 weeks and 4 days. Not the thing I had not yet told a single living soul. Just nerves. I parked near the side entrance, the help's entrance, according to the placement agency's instructions, and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. The folder on the passenger seat held everything: my resume, 2 letters of recommendation, my culinary certifications, a copy of the 6-month contract, room and board included, salary generous enough to make my eyes water when the recruiter quoted it. No prior connection to the household required. The ad had been specific: private chef for a single-occupant estate, must be professional, discreet, able to work independently. Omega applicants welcome. That last line was what made me apply. In most private households, Omegas were hired for other things, or not hired at all, because the liability of an unmated Omega living under an Alpha's roof was considered too complicated. This ad had called it a non-issue. The agency confirmed Mr. Rogers had specifically requested that the domestic dynamic not be a factor in hiring. I hadn't asked why. I was too relieved. My name is Levi Ruiz. I'm 26 years old, trained at a culinary institute on a partial scholarship, and for the last 3 years I had been working double shifts at a catering company while saving money to open my own small restaurant someday. The restaurant plan was now on indefinite hold, because 7 weeks ago something happened that changed every calculation I'd made about my future. I got out of the truck and stood in the autumn air, breathing slowly. The smell of pine and cold earth was clean and sharp. No one nearby. No alpha scent drifting to complicate things. Good. The side door opened before I could knock. The woman who appeared was small and silver-haired, with the kind of face that had spent decades being no-nonsense, and had arrived somewhere warm on the other side of it. She looked me up and down with efficient gray eyes. Levi Ruiz? Her voice was brisk but not unkind. Yes, ma'am. I'm Margaret. I handle the household administration. Mr. Rogers is not here today. He's traveling for work and won't return until Friday. That gives us 2 days to get you oriented. She stepped back to let me in. Come. I'll show you the kitchen first. That seems right, given your role. The kitchen was extraordinary. I had cooked in some excellent kitchens, restaurant kitchens, corporate catering kitchens, a brief and glorious week at a private venue that smelled of good olive oil and fresh herbs, but this kitchen made all of those feel like dress rehearsals. It ran the full width of the back of the house with 3 separate prep stations, a professional 6-burner range, 2 wall ovens, a wood-fired hearth in the corner that made my fingers itch to use it, and a walk-in refrigerator that hummed quietly behind a heavy door. The countertops were dark marble. The overhead lighting was warm. Every pot was copper. Every knife in the magnetic rack looked like it had been chosen with genuine care. Wow, I said before I could stop myself. Margaret's mouth curved slightly. Mr. Rogers takes food seriously. I can see that. He doesn't require elaborate meals. He prefers simple, high-quality food. He keeps unusual hours. Some mornings he wants breakfast at 5. Some evenings dinner isn't wanted until 10. You'll need to be flexible. That's fine. I'm used to adapting. She showed me the pantry, impeccably organized, stocked with things I recognized and several imported items I had only read about, and then walked me through the rest of the ground floor, a formal dining room that was clearly rarely used, a smaller breakfast room with windows overlooking a garden, a long hallway lined with closed doors, a library that smelled of old paper and cedar, which I caught a glimpse of as we passed. The house was beautiful in a muted way, like something that had been designed for comfort rather than impression, and had achieved both without trying. My quarters were above the kitchen. A suite of 2 rooms, modest but private, with my own bathroom and a small sitting area with a window that looked out over the garden and, beyond it, the tree line. There was a writing desk, a good lamp. The bed looked new. You'll take your meals in the kitchen or in your rooms, Margaret told me. You're welcome in any common area of the house unless Mr. Rogers is home and requests otherwise. Any preferences he has, he'll communicate directly." She paused. "He's quiet, private. He doesn't require conversation. If you can respect that, you'll do well here." "I can respect that." She looked at me for a moment longer than felt strictly procedural. Not suspicious exactly, more like she was calibrating something. "The agency said your scent is suppressed?" "Yes. I use suppressants." I kept my voice level. This was standard administrative territory for Omega employees. I've been on them for 3 years. "Good. It simplifies things." She said it without judgment. "Mr. Rogers runs this household professionally. He would not have hired from the Omega category if that were a concern, but it's still considerate." I nodded. In my chest, something kept its own counsel about what was happening chemically in my body that the suppressants were only partially addressing these days. The pregnancy had begun to shift things. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that I had quietly doubled my dosage and hoped for the best. I told myself it was enough. I told myself a lot of things that week. Margaret left me to unpack. I stood at my window and watched the light change in the firs and thought, 6 months. I can do this for 6 months. I can cook beautiful food and be invisible and figure out the rest of my life somewhere in the margins. The baby was not yet a baby in any way I could make fully real. It was a fact I was still negotiating with. A small, insistent, world-altering fact. I put my hand flat against my stomach for a moment. Then I went downstairs to learn the kitchen. Trent Rogers came home on a Thursday, a day early. I was at the hearth, turning a leg of lamb on a slow rotation, not expecting anyone until the following morning. The house had been mine for 2 days, mine and Margaret's, who came in mornings and left by 3, and I had settled into a rhythm I was just beginning to feel comfortable in. I had learned which shelf held the preserved lemons, which drawer had the best whisks, which burner ran slightly hot. I had made myself a small personal map of the kitchen and navigated it with increasing confidence. I heard the front door. Then footsteps, heavy, unhurried, moving through the house with the ease of someone who owned every floorboard of it. And then I felt something. It was subtle, almost ambient, a shift in the atmospheric quality of the house, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Alpha presence. Not a scent exactly. I was on suppressants, he presumably maintained his own propriety, and the kitchen's ventilation was excellent. But something registered in the oldest part of my biology, something that suppressants dampened but could not fully silence. I kept turning the lamb. The kitchen door opened. He was taller than I had pictured from the formal photo in the household packet. 6'3" at least, with a kind of build that read not as deliberately cultivated but as simply constitutional. Broad shoulders, long frame. The easy carriage of someone who moved through the world without having to negotiate space for himself. Dark hair, a little longer than the photo suggested, tired around the eyes with the particular flatness of someone who had been traveling across time zones and had not yet landed fully back in themselves. He wore a dark jacket over an open-collared shirt. He was carrying nothing, no briefcase, no phone visible. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with calm, direct gray eyes. "You're Levi Ruiz." "Yes, you're back early. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. The lamb won't be ready for another hour, but I can." "Don't change it." His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. "Whatever you're making smells right. I'll wait. There's bread from this morning if you want something now, and I can put together a soup. It won't take long." He studied me for a moment, not in the way that made my skin crawl. Not assessing me the way some alphas assessed omegas they encountered in their homes, running a calculation about hierarchy and proximity and biology. He looked at me the way someone looks at a new element in their environment when they're trying to understand what function it serves. "The soup would be good," he said. I nodded and moved to the pantry. When I came back with a carton of stock and a selection of things from the cold shelf, he was still standing in the doorway. "You don't have to stay," I said. Not rudely, just clearly. "I'll send word when dinner's ready." "I know." A pause. "I'll go." He did, and the kitchen exhaled. I made a simple broth-based soup with vegetables from the garden, which Margaret had shown me was immaculately kept by a part-time groundskeeper who came twice a week, and the remainder of the morning's bread. Roasted garlic. A handful of the preserved lemons from the pantry. By the time I carried it to the small breakfast room, the lamb had another 40 minutes, and I had convinced my heartbeat to return to something ordinary. He was sitting at the table without his jacket now, reading something on his phone, and he looked up when I set the bowl down. "Thank you." "Of course. Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I'll set the dining room. Here is fine. This room." He gestured at the smaller space. "I don't use the dining room." "Understood. I'll come back then." I retreated to the kitchen and stood at my station and thought very carefully about nothing in particular. In the days that followed, I learned that Trent Rogers had two modes: absent and present. When absent, he was in his office on the second floor or traveling. He disappeared for days at a time on business I was never told about and had no curiosity regarding. When present, he was in the house in a way that was impossible to be unaware of. Not because he sought attention or made demands. The opposite, in fact. He moved through his own home like someone who had trained himself to occupy minimum space. He read. He exercised in the early mornings, in a room off the east wing I never entered. He sometimes sat in the library for hours, but he was an alpha in his own territory, and no amount of quiet could make that not felt. I managed it. I was professional and efficient and precise. I adapted my schedule to his unusual hours without complaint. Some mornings he appeared in the kitchen at 5:40, still in exercise clothes, and I had coffee ready and something warm. Sometimes a frittata, sometimes fresh bread with good butter and honey. Sometimes a grain porridge with fruit I had macerated overnight. He ate without demanding conversation, and I offered none. Some evenings he didn't want dinner until 9 or 10. Those nights I would prep everything and leave it in a warming state so I could plate in under 4 minutes when he appeared. He always appeared eventually. Cooking for someone who paid genuine, unperformed attention to food was its own particular pleasure. I noticed it in small ways. The slight pause when he first tasted something. The way he sometimes picked up the plate to examine a detail of the presentation. He wasn't performative about it. He didn't praise extravagantly. But when something landed well, his expression shifted by some small, specific increment, and I found myself running kitchen experiments just to produce that shift. He asked me things occasionally. Practical things, mostly. "What's in this? Where did you find this ingredient? How long does this keep?" I answered briefly and factually, and he absorbed the answers and moved on. Twice in the first 2 weeks, he asked my opinion. Once about the wine cellar. He was considering serving a particular bottle at a business dinner and wanted to know if it would suit the menu he'd described. I tasted a small pour he offered, thought about it, and told him honestly that the tannins would fight the fish, but that there was a lighter white 3-racks back that would be perfect. He went and found it without asking me to help. Once about the garden. He was standing at the breakfast room window after dinner, looking out at the kitchen garden in the early dark, and he said, almost to himself, "If I had more time, I'd expand it." And then he glanced at me, already clearing the table, and said, "What would you plant?" I stopped moving, thought about it genuinely because the question seemed to deserve that. "Shiso," I said, "and more fennel than you have. A proper herb spiral if there's room. Maybe a small orchard, even just 4 or 5 fruit trees." I paused. "Figs do well in this climate if you plant them against the south wall." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I'll mention it to the groundskeeper." It wasn't intimacy. It wasn't connection in any complicated sense. It was just the ordinary texture of being in a household together, 2 professionals at their respective tasks, occasionally occupying the same frequency. I told myself that was all it was. And mostly I believed it. By week 4, the suppressants were losing ground. It happened gradually. A slight sharpening of my sense of smell. I could detect the cedar from the library all the way to the kitchen, which I could not have done when I arrived. A soft, persistent warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen ovens. My appetite had normalized in some ways and intensified in others. I found myself craving protein obsessively, and fruit, and anything with good fat in it. My body was quietly insisting on things. I adjusted my dosage again, bought a second bottle when I went into town for weekly supplies, and maintained my composure. What I could not adjust was the scent. Suppressants work by chemically dampening the biological markers that omegas naturally emit. Under normal circumstances, a double dose kept me essentially indetectable. But pregnancy changes the chemistry at a fundamental level, and no pharmaceutical catches up perfectly with those changes. I was still suppressed. I was not suppressed the way I had been. The morning it became a problem, I didn't know it until after. Trent came into the kitchen at 5:50, earlier than usual, while I was in the middle of making a batch of cardamom-spiced granola. The oven was open, the warm spice smell was everywhere, and I was sweating slightly from a brief morning walk that had left me feeling better than I had in days. I was comfortable in my own skin in that moment, and comfort is exactly when the guard drops. He stopped just inside the doorway. I turned from the oven. He was looking at me, not with the calm assessment I had become accustomed to. Something else. Something more alert and more still. "Good morning," I said. "Morning." A pause. Something shifted in him. Some internal adjustment. "Coffee?" "Ready." He crossed to the counter and poured himself a mug, and I watched from the corner of my eye as he deliberately stepped slightly further from me than was strictly necessary to reach it. He took his mug and moved to the far side of the kitchen island, which put 6 feet between us. "What is that?" he asked, nodding at the oven. "Granola. Cardamom, orange zest, oat clusters. It'll be done in about 12 minutes. Smells good." "Thank you." The conversation was entirely normal, but I could feel, with the acuity that pregnancy had apparently bestowed on me without asking, the way he was managing himself. The slight deliberateness of his breathing, the angle of his body not facing me entirely. An alpha who was very carefully being professional. My stomach plummeted. Not because of anything threatening. Trent Rogers had never by word or gesture or expression given me any reason to feel unsafe. But because I understood what his behavior meant, he had detected something, not enough to name or to address maybe, but enough. The granola came out perfectly. I plated it with fresh fruit and yogurt and brought it to the breakfast room. He read while he ate and said nothing further. I went back to my kitchen and sat on a stool at the prep counter and thought very carefully about what I was going to do. The answer I kept arriving at was, nothing yet. There was nothing actionable. I could not tell him. The contract was 6 months and I was barely into month 1, and I needed the money and the stability and the quiet of this place while I figured out the rest of my life. If I disclosed, the contract would almost certainly end, not through malice but because no professional household arrangement could contain the complication of what I was. An unmated pregnant omega under an alpha's roof in a country where the legal and social architecture around those situations remained precisely as messy as it had always been. I needed more time. I ordered a stronger brand of suppressants online, paid express shipping, and held my breath. The days had a rhythm that I clung to. I woke early, earlier than necessary because the baby made sleep increasingly unreliable and I had learned to use those pre-dawn hours as my own. I would sit at my window with tea and watch the sky lighten behind the firs and let the quiet have me for a little while. Then down to the kitchen. The kitchen never failed me. It was the one room where I felt entirely competent, entirely in my element, and where the complications of my body and my situation reduced themselves to background noise. Food has a way of demanding your full presence. You cannot chop well while you're anxious. You cannot balance a sauce while you're in your head. The kitchen insisted on me being simply, cleanly here, and for that I was profoundly grateful. Trent Rogers, I slowly understood, had built this kitchen for the same reason. I pieced it together from small things. The quality of the cookware, not just expensive but specific. The kind of specificity that requires actual knowledge. The fact that the spice rack was organized not alphabetically, but by flavor profile, which was the way I would have done it. A handwritten recipe card tucked inside the back of a drawer I found by accident one morning, written in a firm, private hand, for a lamb stew that looked like it had been refined across many iterations. He cooked, or had cooked, at some point, or wanted to. I found this unexpectedly moving. There was something about a person who wanted to feed people or had wanted to once that made them more dimensional to me. One evening in the 5th week, late, I was prepping stock for the following day when he appeared in the kitchen doorway in a way that felt different from his usual transits. He was in less formal clothes, a soft sweater, no jacket. He looked at the stove with an expression I could only call wistful. "May I?" he asked, which was such an unusual thing for him to say to me in this kitchen that I wasn't immediately sure I understood it. "May you what?" He gestured at the prep counter. "Watch. Or help, if that's not." a slight awkwardness that sat strangely on his otherwise composed face. I won't disrupt the process. I studied him for a moment. I'm making stock, I said. There's nothing interesting happening for the next 2 hours. But if you want to be in here, you can chop these. I pushed a pile of celery across the counter with a cutting board and one of the good knives. He came and washed his hands at the sink and picked up the knife with the ease of someone who knew what they were doing. He didn't confirm this or perform it. He just chopped cleanly and quietly, while I moved around the kitchen doing the dozen other small things that a stock requires. We worked in silence for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something that had texture to it, that required some care to navigate. That recipe card in the second prep drawer, I said eventually. The lamb stew. He glanced up. It's yours, I said. Not a question, a brief pause. From a long time ago. It's a good recipe. The dried mushroom edition is smart. I almost used it last week. Why didn't you? I wanted to try a different direction first. I'll come back to it. Something in his face settled slightly. You're welcome to use it. Change it. Whatever helps. I nodded. We went back to working. The stock took shape. The kitchen smelled of bay and thyme and roasting bones, and the night settled around the house with its particular deep quiet. Why did you stop cooking? I asked near midnight, when the stock was in its long simmer and I was washing the last of the prep equipment. He was silent long enough that I thought I'd overstepped. Ran out of people to cook for, he said. I didn't look at him. I kept washing. But something in my chest moved over to make room for that sentence. The day I turned 8 weeks, I sat on the closed lid of the toilet in my private bathroom and held a second pregnancy test, my 4th overall, as though the number might change, and stared at the same definitive result. 8 weeks, approximately. Give or take a few days. The math of it was something I had lived with since the beginning, but that I still could not quite make fully real. 8 weeks ago was the industry event in the city. 8 weeks ago was the end of my last relationship, which had been with a beta named Marcus who was sweet and careless and ultimately not interested in anything permanent. 8 weeks ago was my previous employer's going away party, which I had attended a little too tired and a little too low, and which had been where I met, briefly accidentally, irreversibly, an alpha whose name I hadn't caught before we were separated by the crowd and whom I had not seen again. I was not looking for Trent Rogers when I applied for this job. I want to say that clearly and without hedging, I was not. I had applied through an agency, submitted my credentials, gone through 2 screening calls with Margaret, and accepted the position based on the contract terms and the photograph of the kitchen. The household packet had included a single formal photograph of the employer, a professional headshot, somewhat distant, taken in what looked like a corporate environment. I had not recognized him. I had not recognized him until I walked into the kitchen of his house and he appeared in the doorway and said my name. And the part of me that had buried one specific autumn evening under 8 weeks of survival instinct suddenly surfaced with violent clarity. The alpha from the party, dark hair, gray eyes, that same unhurried voice. I had made soup and composed myself and said nothing, because what was there to say? What possible version of that conversation existed that ended well, in any direction? I was newly employed, newly housed, dependent on this arrangement for my financial stability and my privacy while I navigated the most complicated situation of my life, and he had no reason to remember me. The party had been large. We had spoken perhaps 20 minutes, standing near a window, before someone had drawn him away. He might not remember at all. I had no way of knowing whether he did. What I did know, what I had to sit with on the edge of my bathroom in the quiet house, was that the child I was carrying was his. And he didn't know, and I was living in his kitchen and cooking his meals and slowly, helplessly becoming someone who knew things about him that made him more real to me than a stranger had any right to be. I was in a situation with no clean exits. I washed my face, put the test in a paper bag to dispose of in town, and went downstairs to start breakfast. The storm came in the 7th week of my employment, which was the 15th week of my pregnancy. I had entered my 2nd trimester. The nausea had largely receded, which was a mercy. Other things had arrived to take its place. My appetite was considerable. My sleep was fitful. My body was beginning to make its changes in ways that were still easy to conceal under the aprons and loose-fitting clothes I wore in the kitchen, but that I was increasingly aware of as I moved through my days. The storm was the kind that arrives in this part of the country in late autumn, sudden, comprehensive, and not interested in negotiations. It came in off the mountains on a Wednesday afternoon, dropped the temperature by 15 degrees in an hour, and proceeded to spend the night dismantling any tree that had the temerity to have a weak branch. The power went out at 8:15. I had been prepping a late dinner. Trent was in the house, working in his office. The kitchen went suddenly dark, and the only light was the glow from the wood fire hearth in the corner, which I had lit an hour earlier more for atmosphere than heat, and which now became the most important light source in the room. I stood in the dark for a moment. Then I moved, carefully, from memory to the hearth, put a proper fire together, and began adapting. Wood fire cooking has always suited me. It requires a different kind of attention, slower and more intuitive, less dependent on precise calibration and more on feel. I moved the cast iron pan I'd been using on the range to the hearth, adjusted what I was doing, and continued. Trent appeared at the kitchen door about 10 minutes later, holding a candle. The firelight did things to the room that the overhead lights had never managed. It made everything amber and soft. The copper pots glowing on their hooks, the marble counters catching the light in a way that felt antique and warm. And it did things to him. Or perhaps I was noticing things about him that the ordinary light had trained me not to notice. The angle of his jaw, the way his eyes caught the flame. He looked at me cooking by the hearth, and he stood in the doorway for what felt like a significant moment before he moved fully into the room. "Power might be out all night," he said. "That's fine. I can do this." I gestured at the hearth. "It'll take longer, but it'll be good." "I know it will." He crossed to the kitchen island and set the candle down. "Can I do anything?" "There are 2 oil lamps in the pantry, second shelf. If you can get them going, it'll help." He found the lamps, found the matches without being directed, and lit them with efficient calm. He set one at each end of the kitchen, and then stood for a moment in the improved light, looking at the setup with an expression that was almost openly approving. "What are you making?" "Started as a braise. Now it's a different kind of braise." I smiled slightly. "The hearth actually does this better than the stove would have." He sat at the kitchen island, not the breakfast room here, in the actual kitchen, and I found I didn't mind. There was something about the storm and the firelight that collapsed the usual professional geometry of the house. Rules about where the help worked and where the employer sat felt thin in the dark, with rain hammering the windows and the fire doing its ancient work. We talked, not urgently, not with any agenda. The way 2 people talk when they're stuck somewhere by weather and there's a fire to look at and the night requires some filling. He told me about traveling. Not details, just impressions, the texture of too many unfamiliar rooms. I told him about culinary school, about the instructor who had terrorized every student while somehow teaching us all more than we wanted to know. He laughed, actually laughed, a low sound that I hadn't heard from him before and that did something unhelpful to my composure. The food was ready at 10. I plated it directly from the cast iron, a slow-braised short rib that had benefited enormously from the wood smoke, with a smashed root vegetable situation and some wilted greens from the garden. He ate at the kitchen island by lamplight, and I cleaned up around him, and neither of us mentioned that this was unusual. Afterward, when the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked for the night, I carried an oil lamp toward the back stairs. He was still sitting at the island with the remains of a glass of wine. "Levy." I stopped. He was looking at the fire, not at me. His voice was even. "You're a good cook," he said. "The best I've had in this house. Thank you." A pause. Then, "Thank you for staying." I wasn't sure if he meant tonight or more generally. I thought perhaps he wasn't sure either. "Good night," I said, and went upstairs. In my room, in the dark, I put my hand on my stomach and felt, for the first time, that I let myself feel it. The faint intimation of something that moved. Just barely. Just the first suggestion of it. I lay there for a long time and didn't sleep. By the beginning of month 3, concealment was no longer something I was managing gracefully. The physical changes were one thing. I wore well-chosen clothes and moved through the kitchen with purpose and speed, and hoped that a body perpetually in motion attracted less scrutiny than a still one. I was mostly right about this. The kitchen gave me cover. The chemistry was something else. My suppressants were at maximum dosage and holding imperfectly. A pregnancy in the second trimester begins to produce its own biological signature, something that no pharmaceutical fully masks, something that an alpha in close proximity will register whether or not they have words for it. I could see it in the way Trent occasionally stilled when I came too near, the way his attention sharpened at certain moments in ways that were carefully and consistently redirected. He was not making it a thing. He was very professionally not making it a thing. This, paradoxically, made it worse. Because if he had been inappropriate or demanding or even openly curious, I could have held the situation at arm's length. His restraint made him someone I kept finding reasons to admire. The evening it came apart was unremarkable in every other way. I had been on my feet since 4:30 a day of prep, a special dinner for 3 business guests who had come and gone by 9, and then the post-dinner cleanup that always takes longer than you think. By 10, I was tired in a bone-deep way that no longer just meant overworked. I was sitting on the stool at the prep counter eating the small plate I always saved for myself at the end of service when I felt the sudden specific sensation of dizziness that I had learned over the past several weeks to respect immediately. I gripped the counter. It passed. I sat very still for a moment and then stood carefully because I needed to finish putting the last of the equipment away and get upstairs. Standing was apparently the wrong call. I don't remember falling. I remember the floor being much closer than expected, and then I remember sitting against the base of the cabinet with my shoulder aching from the catch. And then I remember Trent Rogers kneeling on the kitchen floor in front of me with an expression on his face that I had never seen on him before. Alarm. Genuine, unguarded alarm. Levi. His hands were on my shoulders, not hard, steady. Levi, look at me. I looked at him. Are you hurt? Where are you hurt? I'm fine, I said, which was both true and spectacularly insufficient. You fell. I caught myself on the cabinet. I'm fine. I just got dizzy. He was close enough that all the suppressants in the world were negotiating with chemistry they couldn't win against, and I was too tired and too rattled to manage my own responses the way I normally would have. I could feel the warmth of him from a foot away and the steadiness of his hands and the way he was watching me with his full attention. And I was very abruptly aware of how alone I had been for 3 months with the thing I was carrying. Not just the child, the weight of the secret, the sustained effort of carrying it solo, invisibly, daily. Levi. His voice was lower now. Something in it was different. Still steady, but closer to something I didn't have a professional category for. I need you to tell me what's going on. I opened my mouth to say something reassuring and deflecting, and what came out instead was, I'm pregnant. The kitchen held the word for a moment. His hands didn't move. His face did something complex that resolved into stillness. How far? He asked. 15 weeks. A longer silence. I watched him process this. Whatever he was feeling, he was doing it internally, with the same contained discipline he brought to everything. His hands finally moved, not away, to my arms, steadier. Can you stand? Yes. He helped me up slowly and guided me to the stool. He poured a glass of water and put it in front of me and then stood on the other side of the counter and looked at me, and I could not read his expression now at all. You've been working like this, he said, since you arrived. I'm a professional. That's not an accusation. His voice was very quiet. I'm saying you've been carrying this alone the entire time you've been here. I didn't answer. The water was cold and real in my hand. Are you? He stopped, started again. Is there someone, the other parent? No. I looked at the counter. It was brief. I don't have contact. Another silence, longer. What do you need right now? He asked. It was such a specific question. Not what are you going to do, not how did this happen, not the dozen questions that might have been asked and that I had been dreading. Just, what do you need? Right now. My throat did something complicated. I need to go to bed, I said. I'm very tired. Okay. He came around the counter. I'll walk you up. He did. He didn't touch me unnecessarily, just walked close enough that the dizziness couldn't catch me off guard again, up the back stairs and to the door of my suite. At the door he stopped. Tomorrow, he said. We'll talk tomorrow, he said. There's no urgency. Sleep. I nodded. Levi. His voice stopped me inside the door. I looked back. You should have told me. Not angry, something quieter than anger, and harder to know what to do with. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and cried very quietly. For the first time in 3 months, he made breakfast. I came downstairs at 7, having slept 8 hours with an exhausted totality I hadn't managed in weeks, and found him in the kitchen. He had his back to the door, and the smell of coffee was already in the room, and something was cooking that smelled of butter and herbs. He heard me come in and glanced over his shoulder. Sit down, he said. I can sit down. I sat at the kitchen island. He turned back to what he was doing, which was, I realized, a very careful omelette, the French kind, the threefold kind that requires constant attention and a particular relationship with the heat. He handled the pan with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times and still found it worth doing well. He plated it perfectly with a small salad and toast and sliced fruit and set it in front of me. Then he poured 2 coffees, set one at my elbow, and took the other around to the other side of the island. Decaf, he said, nodding at my cup. I wasn't sure if you were avoiding caffeine. I picked up the cup. Yes, thank you. He sat down across from me. He had clearly already eaten. There was evidence of it, a cleaned plate set aside on the counter. He was watching me with that gray-eyed attention that I had learned over 3 months to read in its smallest gradations. Right now it was careful, patient, attentive without pressing. How do you feel this morning? He asked. Better. The dizzy spell was from not eating enough at the end of the day. I know the corrective. Good. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Eat, we can talk after. I ate. The omelet was exceptional. He had used the herb butter I'd made on Sunday, which I noted, and which said something about how much attention he had been paying to his own kitchen. The fruit was perfect. The toast was from bread I had made 2 days ago. When I finished, I pushed the plate aside and looked at him. You have questions, I said. I have one question, he said, and I want you to know before I ask it that however you answer, your position here is not affected. The contract holds. Margaret can adjust your schedule to accommodate whatever you need. None of this changes the professional arrangement. A pause. Understood? I nodded. The event, he said, in the city. 8 weeks before you started here, the industry party. My breath went very still. He was watching me with a steadiness that made it impossible to look away. I recognized you, he said quietly, the first day you arrived. I wasn't certain immediately, but by the end of that evening, yes. The kitchen was very quiet. You didn't say anything, I said. Neither did you. A pause. I wasn't sure if you recognized me, or if you had, whether you wanted the acknowledgement. He set down his mug. You came here professionally. I didn't want to complicate that by making assumptions. I looked at the counter. Levi. His voice was very gentle. Is it mine? I could have said I don't know. I could have said the math isn't certain. Both of these things contained enough technical ambiguity that they might have held, but they would have been lies by omission, and sitting in this kitchen that I had made my home over 3 months, eating food he had cooked for me, I found I couldn't. Yes, I said. The room absorbed this. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was different, not controlled in its usual way, but very careful in a different way, like someone moving deliberately over uncertain ground. Why didn't you tell me, when you realized who I was? I looked at him directly. Because I needed this job, because I had nothing else arranged, because I had no way of knowing how you would respond, and every reason to expect it would be complicated, and I stopped. Started again. Because I was scared. Scared of me? Scared of the situation. I met his eyes. You've never given me reason to be scared of you specifically. He was quiet, looking at me with something in his face that I still couldn't fully name. I don't know what you want, I said. From this situation, from this information, I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for anything from you. I know you're not, he said. I can finish the contract, or I can leave, or... Levy! His voice stopped me. I'd like you to stay. A beat. Not just for the contract, he said. I'd like you to stay. The kitchen felt very large and very small at the same time. I need time, I said. I need to think about what this all means. I don't know what I want either. This is not a situation I planned. I know. He stood, picked up his empty mug and mine, moved to the sink. His back was to me. Neither did I. But that doesn't mean it isn't. He stopped. The water ran for a moment. He turned it off. That's enough for now. He turned to face me, and something in his expression had settled into something I might, in a different vocabulary, have called resolved. Take the morning off. Rest. I'll arrange for the morning things myself. A slight pause that might have been the closest thing he had to a joke. I can manage the kitchen. I know you can, I said, and the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Things changed, quietly, structurally, without drama. Margaret came in the following Monday, and we had a calm conversation about adjusted hours and a revised workload that acknowledged I was in my second trimester and would need to be in my third before the contract concluded. The conversation was professional and practical. Margaret was, I suspected, almost entirely unsurprised by the situation's development, and managed her lack of surprise with her usual silver-haired discretion. My hours were reduced to a pace that was sustainable without being ceremonial about it. Trent made no comment on this reduction, but I noticed that on the days when dinner was more involved, he appeared in the kitchen to help with prep with the same casual efficiency he'd demonstrated during the storm. He was learning what I was making and doing the parts he could, not taking over, not imposing, helping. It was more disarming than it had any right to be. We talked more in the evenings, not always about significant things, often about very ordinary things, what I was planning to make for the following week, the progress of the garden, where the groundskeeper had tentatively agreed to try the fig tree against the south wall, books we'd read which turned out to be a territory we partially shared. He preferred history and biography, I tended toward fiction and food writing, and there was enough overlap that the library became a room we both existed in occasionally. He didn't press the significant conversations before I was ready for them. Whatever he was feeling about the revelation we'd had in the kitchen, he was processing it in his own interior way and bringing me only what was necessary. Once, about 2 weeks after the kitchen conversation, he appeared at my suite door in the early evening. He was carrying a book. He held it up without explanation. There's a chapter on feeding people through difficult winters in this. Historically, I thought you might find it interesting. I took the book. My fingers brushed his briefly. Neither of us commented on this. Thank you, I said. He nodded and went back downstairs. I stood in my doorway for a moment, holding the book, listening to his footsteps on the stairs. This, I thought, was a man who had run out of people to cook for, who had built a perfect kitchen in a large, quiet house and then not known exactly how to fill it. Who asked to watch? Who asked to help? Who made an omelet in the morning with the herb butter from the Sunday batch because he'd been paying attention? I was beginning to understand that the man I'd met briefly at a party 8 weeks before any of this, before the job, before the kitchen, before the storm and the fall and the conversation at the island, had been one version of Trent Rogers, and the man who lived in this house, quiet and deliberate and occasionally carefully warm, was something fuller. I was beginning to understand that I was in considerable trouble. It happened on a Sunday evening in my 4th month. The garden had produced the last of its autumn yield. I had made something celebratory of it. A long, slow roast with root vegetables and wild herbs, a good braise, a tart with the season's final apples that smelled of cinnamon and brown butter from an hour before it came out of the oven. We ate in the breakfast room, which had become the default. The candles were lit, rain on the windows. After dinner, neither of us moved immediately. This had also become something that happened occasionally, a mutual unspoken agreement that the table did not have to be cleared just yet. He poured the last of the wine. He had been doing this more carefully since the revelation, never offering me more than a single small glass, which I still declined. And he looked at me across the table with the particular quality of attention that I had learned preceded something honest. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know you don't have to answer tonight. Or at all, if you don't want to. Okay? He was quiet for a moment, turning the wine glass. What do you want? For your life, after the contract. I looked at the window. Rain made patterns on the glass. I wanted to open a restaurant, I said. Before all this, that was the plan. A small place, seasonal menu, local ingredients, 50 seats. I smiled slightly at the memory of how straightforward that future had seemed. The timeline has moved. Moved or gone. Moved or gone, I said, with more certainty than I'd allowed myself before. It's still what I want. The child doesn't change that. It changes the path, but not the destination. No, he said. It wouldn't. A silence. I looked at him. I'd invest, he said quietly, if that were something you wanted. In the restaurant, when the time comes. I held very still. I'm not offering that as leverage, he added, or to complicate what you think I think about this situation. I'm saying it because it's what's true. I would want to see you do the thing you want to do. Trent. His name felt different in my mouth than it had 3 months ago, when it had been part of a professional vocabulary. Now it felt like something I was holding carefully. I don't know what we are, I said. I don't know what the right word is for any of this. No, he agreed. Neither do I. I'm scared, I said, of making a wrong decision because I'm vulnerable, of attaching meaning to something that might be proximity and circumstance. That's fair, he said. I'd be scared of the same thing in your position. Are you scared of anything? I asked. In this situation? Are you scared of anything? I asked. In this situation? He looked at me for a long moment. Yes, he said. That you'll leave and take. He stopped. Chose a different construction. That you'll go when the contract ends and I won't have. Another stop. His jaw worked slightly. I'm not good at saying certain things. I've noticed. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm working on it. The rain came harder for a moment, then softened. The candles moved in some draft I couldn't identify. I'm not planning to disappear, I said, carefully. However the rest of this works out, I stopped myself on the word involved, which was accurate but insufficient. You're part of this. That's not something I'd exclude you from, regardless of anything else. He absorbed this. Okay, he said. He exhaled slowly. Okay. We sat there in the candlelight for another hour talking about something else entirely. The fig tree, the groundskeeper's progress. A book he'd finished the previous week, and the difficult conversation settled itself into the room without requiring any further excavation. It was enough. For now, it was genuinely enough. In the 5th month, I felt the baby move in a way that was unmistakable. Not the tentative intimations of the storm night. This was deliberate, purposeful, the little jab of something with opinions. I was standing at the prep counter making pasta dough, both hands in the flour, and the movement was so clear and distinct that I laughed out loud before I could stop myself. Trent was in the kitchen. He'd been sitting at the island reading, which he did sometimes in the evenings now without remark. My laugh made him look up. The baby moved, I said, and then immediately felt exposed for having said it that way. That directly, that openly. He put his book down. Just now, the first real kick. Like actually deliberate. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face had gone very careful. Is that? He stopped. Then, very quietly, may I? I looked at him. My hands were still in the pasta dough covered in flour. Yes, I said. He came around the island and stood beside me at the counter. I took one floury hand and pressed it, gently, against the side of my stomach, the left side, where the movement had been. We stood like that for a moment, nothing. It might not, I started. And then the baby obliged, 3 distinct small movements against his palm, unmistakable. His breath changed. He went absolutely still, hand flat against my side, and his face did something that had no professional category at all, that stripped away every controlled and measured thing about him and left something much simpler underneath. Wonder. Pure, uncomplicated wonder. Hi, he said. So quietly. Not to me. I didn't say anything. I was not capable of saying anything at that particular moment. He stood there for a long time, and then slowly straightened and took his hand back and turned to face the counter, and I could see that he was taking a moment. Thank you, he said, voice slightly rougher than usual. Sure, I said. I went back to the pasta dough. He went back to the island and opened his book, but neither of us was reading or cooking for the next few minutes. We were both somewhere in the adjacent country of what had just happened. Later he said, "I'd like to go to the next appointment, if that's—" "Yes," I said before he could finish qualifying it. "Yes, I'd like that." The winter came in early. The estate looked different under snow. Quieter, if that was possible, the firs holding white along every branch, the garden dormant under a clean layer that the groundskeeper hadn't disturbed. The kitchen was warmer than any other room in the house and was where I spent most of my time. My pregnancy was undeniable now. Not just to me, not just to Tret and Margaret. I was solidly in my second half, and my body had committed entirely to the enterprise. I had adjusted everything about the way I moved in the kitchen, had rethought ergonomics and reach, and how long I could stand comfortably before I needed to sip. I had become, out of necessity, a more methodical and less improvisational cook, and had discovered that this version of cooking also had satisfactions. Trent had become something, not my employer, still that, technically, but that category had long since been overtaken by others. Not a friend exactly, though friendship was part of the texture of it. Not a partner yet, though I was no longer certain that distinction was accurate either. He was the person who appeared in the kitchen every evening, who had read 3 books on pregnancy nutrition and was now quietly and without comment adding things to the grocery orders, who sat at the appointment with a composure I could see was effortful, watching the ultrasound screen with that gray-eyed focus he brought to everything he deemed worth his full attention. He had held my hand. During the appointment, he had reached over in the white clinical room with the doctor asking professional questions and the ultrasound showing what was clearly and definitively a person in formation, and he had taken my hand in his large, warm one and held it with a steadiness that said, "You are not doing this alone." I had not let go for the duration of the appointment. The night he said it, we were in the library. He had shown me the library, truly shown it, walked me through the shelves, pointed out particular things, sometime in the 3rd month. Since then it had become part of my late evenings, the hours after kitchen work was done when I couldn't sleep. He kept the same unreliable hours. Sometimes we were both there, in adjacent chairs by the fire, reading separately. This was its own form of companionship that I had become dependent on without noticing. It was late, past midnight. The fire was low. I had set my book down because my back had begun to complain about the chair, and I was just sitting in the warm room, not reading, listening to the snow and the fire. He put his book down too. Levi. I love you. The fire popped. Snow shifted on a branch outside the window and fell. I looked at him. He was looking at me with the same directness he'd brought to every honest thing he'd ever said. "I know the timing is," he paused. "I know there are 100 reasons why this is complicated and why you might not—" Another pause. He exhaled. "I told you I was working on saying things. I wanted to say this before more time passed, and it became—" He stopped. Started over. "I love you. I'd have said it sooner, but I was trying to be careful not to press you." I looked at him for a long moment. "How long?" I asked. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which I appreciated. "The storm," he said. "I think. Watching you cook at the hearth." A slight pause, possibly before that. The fire was very low now. Just coals mostly, but the room was still warm. "I'm scared," I said. "I've been scared the whole time. Of wanting something and being wrong about what it is. I know, I've been patient." "You have." I looked at the coals. "It's one of the things that makes it harder to be uncertain. Patient people they're harder to doubt." "Is that a complaint?" I laughed, which surprised me. "No. It's not a complaint." He waited. I turned to look at him. He was there, exactly where he always was, calm and present and not asking for anything I wasn't ready to give. "I love you too," I said. "I think I've been trying not to for a while." He stood up, crossed to my chair, and crouched down to my level, which was not a graceful motion for a man of his height and which I found unexpectedly endearing. He took my hands in both of his. "Okay," he said quietly. "Then we figure the rest out together." "There's a lot to figure out." "I know. We'll figure it out." He was very close. His eyes were warm in the dim room. "We have time." I leaned forward and kissed him. It was quiet and unhurried and entirely unlike the brief electric moment at the party months ago. It was more than that, the accumulated weight of 3 months of proximity and careful attention and mutual restraint releasing itself slowly, like a long-held breath. When it ended, his forehead rested against mine. "There's something I should tell you," I said quietly. "What's that?" "The recipe card in the second prep drawer. The lamb stew." I pulled back just enough to see his face. "I used it last week. I think I improved it." He looked at me. "How?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was both offended and delighted. "Anchovies," I said, "and a half glass more wine. That's not an improvement." "It objectively is. I'll make it again, and you can tell me I'm wrong." "You're already wrong. We'll see." He was still holding my hands. The fire had gone entirely to coals, and the snow was quiet outside, and somewhere in the warm house a future was quietly assembling itself in the dark. The new year arrived without ceremony. January in the estate was deep and cold and very still, and I was 7 months pregnant and had fully surrendered to the reality that the restaurant plan would require another year at minimum, and that this was acceptable, and that acceptable was a word I was slowly replacing with good. Things were different and the same. I still cooked. It was my work and my nature, and I would no sooner have stopped than I would have stopped breathing. The kitchen was still mine. But mine in the way that a shared thing is yours when the other person has been invited into it. Trent cooked on Sundays. This had evolved organically. I had Sundays as my formal rest day, and he had taken to using the kitchen himself, appearing mid-morning with a plan, and working through it with the focused quiet of someone who was both skilled and a little out of practice. I sat at the island on those mornings and drank decaf and watched him cook. And the pleasure of this was disproportionate to anything I could easily explain. He made mistakes. The first Sunday he slightly oversalted a broth, caught it, corrected it without comment. He burned the first attempt at a caramel in my copper pot, which he apologized for with such specificity that I laughed for 2 solid minutes. He plated things with the efficiency of someone who hadn't developed an aesthetic investment in plating, and I gave him small notes that he received with the same complete seriousness he'd brought to everything. "You're a good student," I told him one Sunday in January. "I had a good teacher," he said. "Don't be smooth. I'm telling you something true." He turned from the stove and looked at me in the sideways amused way that I had come to understand as his version of warmth made visible. "You're telling me I'm good at being taught? That's a very specific compliment. Most people are bad at it, especially alphas." "I'll take it." I shifted on the stool, adjusting for the baby's current position, which had been opinionated all week about lumbar support. Trent noticed, he always noticed, and came over without making a production of it, adjusting the small pillow on the stool that had appeared there one morning without explanation. "Better?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." He went back to the stove. I watched his hands, which I had developed a more than professional relationship with over the months. The sureness of them, the care. "What do you want to name her?" I asked. He stilled for a moment. We had found out the gender at the 20-week appointment, and he had not brought up names, waiting for me to do it. This was so characteristic of him, the patience, the waiting for me to lead, that it had taken me until now to understand I was ready. He was quiet for a moment, thinking genuinely. "I had a great aunt," he said, "who was the most capable person I ever knew. Her name was June." I turned this over. "June," I said. "June Ruiz Rogers." His back was to me. A brief pause. "Or Rogers Ruiz," he said carefully. "However you'd prefer." "June Ruiz Rogers," I said again. "That's what it sounds like to me." He turned, and there was something in his face that was very simple and very full. "Okay," he said. "June." The labor began on a Thursday morning early while I was in the kitchen out of habit rather than need, standing at the counter looking at the garden in the snowlight, holding a cup of decaf and thinking about spring and what I'd plant and whether the figs would have taken yet. The first contraction was a surprise, which I've been told is almost universal, something that announces itself differently from everything you've imagined. Trent appeared within moments. I don't know how he knew, but he appeared in the kitchen doorway fully dressed for someone who'd clearly been awake. "Now?" he asked. "Not quite now," I said, "but yes." He came to the counter and stood beside me, and we watched the garden together for a moment. "I'm scared," I said, which was the truth and which I no longer needed to contain. "I know," he said, His hand found mine on the counter. Me too, it's still going to be fine. How do you know? I don't, but I'm committed to the position. I laughed, which caught us both off guard. And in the middle of the laugh, another contraction came, and he didn't let go of my hand, and we started making our way to where we were supposed to be going. Margaret had arranged a local midwife team. We had planned this. Trent had, characteristically, over-prepared and understated it, and everything was in order. June Rogers Ruiz, we had negotiated, was born in the late afternoon. While the January light was going gold in the west windows and the house smelled of the soup Trent had made in the early morning and left on a low simmer on the hearth. She was very small and had strong opinions about the world, which she expressed immediately. He held her first. I was exhausted in the most total and specific way a body can be exhausted, and he held her in the way that big people sometimes hold very small ones, with a precision born from not trusting their own hands to be gentle enough. He looked at her face. I watched him look at her. He was someone who had run out of people to cook for, who had built a perfect kitchen and filled it with the best equipment and then stood in its doorway asking to watch, asking to help, asking with enormous care to be let in. He looked at her and I thought, this is what you were waiting for. This is the specific shape of the future you didn't know you were trying to build. The fig tree took, I found out in late April, when I went out to check the south wall and found the first green growth, tentative and certain at the same time, along 3 of the 4 trees we planted in February. June was in the carrier on my chest, asleep with the placid totality of very young people, and the garden smelled of turned earth, and the particular green smell of early spring. Trent appeared at the back door. He had been inside on a call, which I knew, and had come out as soon as it ended, which I also knew, because this was the kind of thing I knew about him now. The figs took, I said without turning around. He came down the garden path and stood beside me. He had June's small fist wrapped around his finger within approximately 5 seconds of arriving, which was also the kind of thing I knew. 3 out of 4, he said. That's good odds. The 4th might still come. Give it another week. We stood there in the spring garden with our daughter between us and the firs at the edge of the property beginning to show new growth at their tips, and the house behind us full of the smell of the soup I'd put on that morning, the lamb stew. His recipe with my anchovies and extra wine and the addition of a handful of dried mushrooms that had been my own, which he had finally last month admitted made it better. The contract ended 2 months ago, he said. I know. You stayed. I know that too. He looked at me, and the expression on his face was the one I'd first started cataloging in the kitchen of this house, in the lamplight and firelight of an autumn that felt like a different version of my life. The one with no professional category. Are you going to keep staying? He asked. That depends, I said. On what? I looked at the figs. On whether you're going to let me expand the herb spiral. The current one is too small. A silence. Then, how much bigger? Significantly. He considered this. I'll talk to the groundskeeper. Then yes, I said. I'm going to keep staying. June stirred in the carrier, made a small declarative sound, and settled back into sleep. The garden smelled of spring. In the house, the soup was on a slow simmer, and the kitchen was waiting the way good kitchens wait. Warm, ready, full of the patient evidence of everyone who had ever cooked something there and meant it. I took his hand. He held it. We stood there in the early sun and let the morning be exactly what it was. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story. And if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.